Okay, I am super excited about this panel because we have, again, like we had that congressional panel earlier, but like these are the people that I go to when I want perspective on what's actually happening as a result of a policy change or a law in the marketplace. And so I want to just, kind of go down the line, starting with Ryan. Ryan's with with the Paragon Health Institute. But Ryan and I worked together on the Hill for 20 years, and our goal was to make things better. And the political process is hard to get everything you want, but Ryan was always there to kind of fight for the consumer, I think, and now is filling a key role at the Paragon Health Institute to examine drug policy and other policies, but also to be a liaison to Congress and to help guide them as they make decisions. And I think Paragon has been excellent in putting out actionable research, good policies for Congress to kind of grab hold of and run with. So, Ryan, we just heard from John. What's your take on how current drug policy is affecting, particularly on the pharmaceutical side of things, the pricing side or coverage or reimbursement side?
Well, I guess I'll say a couple of things and get into that. You've had a lot of great speakers here, and it's hard to follow John, but I'll try. When it comes to drug pricing, both from a policy perspective and a political perspective, I don't think we can ignore the fact of the pricing disparity between the U.S. and Europe. And that's maybe more of a political question than it's a policy question. But, when you have a consumer goes in and they get a drug, they don't know if that drug's value is worth $10,000 or $20,000. They know if it works for them. They can't really discern the value. But what they can see is if it costs $20,000 to the United States and it costs $10,000 overseas, then they start to question, okay, what's the value? And that's going to continue to be a political issue as much as a policy issue going forward. And I don't think until that delta is sort of closed that we can actually sort of get beyond the politics of it. Now, my sort of preference is let's not close it by saying we're going to adopt European price controls. But we do have to have a system where the United States is not the only country that is funding research and development of new drugs. So that would be the first point. The second point is actually I definitely want to piggyback off what John said related to new indications, because actually it's very personal to me. The IRA, there are a lot of things I don't think the policymakers actually sort of took into account in terms of consequences of their policy decisions. And the effects on the development of new indications, I think, is probably the primary one. The negotiation, as John mentioned, that does have an effect. I mean, it takes time to get a drug, one approved, and then you're going to decide whether I'm going to do another trial to get a new indication. But then also, if you're a company and you invest $50 million or $100 million to get a new indication, you got the inflation rebates on there. So I can't actually get a return on my investment even during the pre-negotiation window. I'm lucky. I take a drug infusion every 2 weeks. It was originally approved for rheumatoid arthritis, not for my indication. I'm afraid that if we had the IRA when I needed it, that we wouldn't have the indication for what I needed it for. And as John mentioned, that's particularly acute for cancer. I mean, cancer drugs usually get approved for one type of cancer and the type of body gets approved, and they go and they get a follow-on indication. I mean, how many indications does Keytruda have now? I can't even keep track. But under the IRA, definitely there would be much fewer, if any, new indications. Why would you spend the money when you have that inflation rebate on you and you have that sort of ticking clock of negotiation? I think the third thing when it comes to drug pricing, and this is sort of the policy versus sort of political debate. I was up on the Hill during IRA, and the biggest thing that frustrated me was that we were just not having an honest debate on drug pricing. If we want a system which sort of we incentivize the inflation of the net to list bubble because we want to use rebates to buy down premiums, that's okay. If we want to have that debate, but we weren't having that debate. We were saying, okay, here, the price of a drug, we were looking at the list price of a drug and saying that's the price that consumers pay through their health plans. There was one member of Congress that went on the floor during the IRA debate and said it's unconscionable that if you have health insurance that you pay $600 a month for your insulin. Well, that's just not true. That doesn't happen. And so we weren't necessarily having an honest debate. And I think we do need to have an honest debate when it comes to drug pricing. We need to have an honest debate on net to list price. We also need to make sure that we're taking into account that in the US, as opposed to other European systems, it's just not the commercial net price, but we have massive federal discounts. John mentioned the 340B program. It's growing exponentially. You also have statutory Medicaid rebates. You also have massive discounts given to the VA. There are other discounts. Those are probably the three biggest. And we have to take that into account when we say, okay, what are we paying for a drug? We got to look at what the federal government is requiring drug companies to actually pay back in rebates to get a true sort of picture of what that drug costs. And so those would be the three things I highlight that hopefully are a little bit different than that you've heard so far today.
Let me ask you a follow-up question there. And two facts that you may not be aware of. Drug costs represents about 10% of our healthcare dollar. There's a little three-pager on a snapshot of the market in your handouts. But it's 10%, right? Like the 50% is hospitals and doctors. But we've, in Washington, been focusing on drugs for a long time. And the other thing that I think most people don't know is that net prices of drugs are actually negative this year. And the gross price is 1.7%, well below inflation, right? So is this all politics? Like,
well,
are there real problems we need to solve?
I mentioned insulin. Even going through the IRA debate, insulin from a net price perspective was actually going down year over year since 2016. And then you talk about, is it politics or is it policy? After the IRA passed, CMS changed the regulations on what the total cost of a drug was to the Part D program. It used to be inclusive of rebates and all price concessions. And now they said, no, we're just going to make it out of gross. To me, that was definitely a political calculation because we knew that the first batch of negotiated drugs would come out in September, or the price would come out in September before the presidential election. And so what they wanted to do was show them the biggest decrease in sort of drug pricing that you got from negotiation. So you had a situation where they said, okay, one drug, they got I think they said a 75% discount. However, actually, the net price of the drug was 73% below what the gross price of the drug was. So that goes back to the honesty of the debate, and I think that answers your question. Is this really a political issue or is this a policy issue? I was on a panel earlier today. We were talking about site neutrality in Medicare hospital payments. Hospitals represent about 50% of all, particularly all Medicare spending. I don't know what it is related to all healthcare spending. We can't do a simple thing of saying we're going to pay the hospital the same price we're going to pay a physician office when they do the exact same thing. That to me is a common sense policy, but it doesn't have the political sort of oomph that you get from saying we're taking on big pharma. And so I do think it's a highly political question. But to John's point, people when they go to the pharmacy counter and they say, I'm going to pay a cost share, or I'm going to pay co-insurance based off of the gross cost of a drug, people do feel what the price of drugs are. My perspective is the patient at the pharmacy counter should get access to the negotiated price, which I do believe, Joel, you worked on Part D, was kind of the intent, how the statute was written.
It was the intent. It was, yeah. We had a last follow-up question. Kirsten, I'll go to you next. We had someone in the audience ask a question about they got some emergency surgery in Germany, and it was like massively less. You talked about the 20,000 drug here, 10,000 overseas. I don't know. That sounds good to me. Why don't we do that?
So it's interesting when we had the markup of HR 3, which was the precursor to the IRA back in 2019 when I worked for Energy and Commerce. My boss at the time, he mentioned that very same thing because we had data that shows if you get a liver transplant in the United States, it costs 4 times as much as getting in the UK and Germany. And so he's like, okay, well, if we're going to import foreign price controls, let's do it for hospital services as well. And you can imagine that there were groups that were very freaked out about that.
Yes, very concerned.
Yeah.
But is the downside access? Is it like what?
I mean, I think that it is a true statement that our hospitals are much more innovative than foreign hospitals in terms of coming up with new techniques, new surgeries, sort of groundbreaking things. I mean, I can't remember the last time we read a story about a new surgical invention in Europe that wasn't happening before in the United States. And so we are on the sort of cusp of innovation here in the U.S., but it does beg the question of whether or not there should be a 4x difference in the cost of services.
Yeah. All right, Kirsten, visiting resident fellow AEI biopharmaceutical advisor. The theory on the IRA was we're going to get lower prices on drugs and patients will benefit. They'll get a lower price. You've done a lot of research on this. Talk to us about what's playing out in the marketplace.
Thank you so much. And of course, like everybody else here, my views are my own, not those of any company I advise or AEI. Well, we saw what happened in the first round of 10 drugs. The federal government announced $6 billion of savings, which even that was an overcount because what they neglected to say was these drugs will also not be paying the discounts in the part before the catastrophic zone. There's like benefit design discounts. So even that was an overstatement. And then also you've got the premium subsidy, so there's another $5 billion. As I was just saying to you all before, like if the federal government said we're going to choose the 10 stupidest drugs and control their prices, that would have been a fine way to do the IRA. Or even say we're going to choose more drugs and we're going to do it after 14 years or 13 years because those drugs should have had competition by now, because most drugs do have competition by now, and come up with the money that way. That probably would have been fine and non-distorting. But to choose the drugs that are most popular means they're most often on formulary, they're most often getting discounts already privately negotiated, and they're being used by a lot of people. Now, not all of them. Some of the drugs are high-priced and used by a small number of people, but there's nothing to say these are the right drugs to negotiate, and it's also not a negotiation. I mean, what I find particularly troubling about the IRA is if you needed to scratch an itch because you just hate drug companies and you wanted to write a law that was really, made you feel good about that, well, I think that's been accomplished. But even in the debate and discussion leading up to the Affordable Care Act, there was a lot more dialogue between private industry and the government. And not everything was maybe taken in, but if you had brought any one of us who work in private industry and described what you're going to do in the IRA, they would have said, oh, higher launch prices, oh, worse access to formulary, oh, and all kinds of shenanigans around the R&D because they're going to try to split the drugs into smaller slices so they don't reach that threshold. And that's all the behavior that you don't want drug companies doing. You want them sending the R&D dollars towards the drugs that meet the highest unmet need, right? Like if we had had this meeting 10 years ago, everyone here would have been saying, hepatitis C, man, it's killing us. The health system is going to be crushed. Did any one person today say anything about hepatitis C and how we're in this pickle because of hepatitis C? No, because those drugs, there's competition, the prices have come down, and it's not what's killing the health system. So we maybe do have a temporal problem and that some drugs are very expensive and some drugs are very cheap, but that is the purpose of insurance. You're supposed to bundle a whole bunch of stuff together, some of it expensive and some of it's cheap, and pay one amount for it, and hopefully have some clinical decision-making in how and what you get. So there's a lot of flaws with the IRA, but I think the main one being it just doesn't take into account at all how you're going to get savings and the reaction of private industry to that law, which is not going to be money-saving, and it's going to be harmful to patients.
So one of the things we saw, I briefly touched on this in my opening remarks, is already the law is kind of driving it's destabilized the Part D market, right? Like, and we see higher premiums, fewer plans. On the formularies, though, I think what we saw was a bit of a narrowing of formularies, not much this year, but like much higher cost sharing on those formularies. Are you seeing a lot more management of those formularies too, in addition to the cost increases? Like what's your sense there?
And if I can, I'd love to speak both to the formularies and which plans are exiting. So yes, we're seeing that the drugs that are up for selection are largely on formulary, but you're seeing coinsurance in particular go up a lot in 2025. We've also seen, by looking at the plans that exited in 2024, when you compare different areas of the country, the areas of the country that have the lowest income and the least dense population is where there's seen the most plan exits and also the most premium increases. Right? Because for lots of reasons, but in part because there's more MAPD plans in more densely populated areas of the country. So if PDPs leave, at least they have another option. So, and that's likely related to the IRA, right? We know that it's going to be harder for a standalone plan to survive in the IRA. So as much as like this law might have been designed to really kick the drug companies in the shins, it's actually having a broader effect on people and their access to medicine. And the people who probably can least afford to have their access to medicine restricted.
Yeah. If you go to chc.net, you'll see a op-ed there from me and Ed Hasemeyer from Heritage on what is happening in the 2025 market. It's pretty, it's kind of frightening, actually. And if that trend persists, we talked to some plans who have said maybe in 2 or 3 years we won't be in the standalone market anymore. And if that's the case, then you really don't have a choice between fee-for-service and Medicare Advantage. You're going to go to Medicare Advantage.
Exactly, and Medicare Advantage may be the right plan for a lot of people, and it may not be, right? Like you hear people with rare disease often prefer to go to fee-for-service because they can get the provider of their choice. And the point is you want to have both, and you want to have a robust market for both.
Competitive market.
Competitive market.
Yeah.
And, and we're not getting anything out of these price controls, right? Like if we'd taken that $3 billion that CMS is getting to administer this program and said, we're going to, whatever. CMS has the best data in the world. We're going to put $3 billion into open access. Every person who wants to research these drugs and tell me whether or not they're giving good value, like that would have been a way to kick the drug companies in the shins by interrogating their drugs. Are they worth it? Making the data available to people, but not in this way that no one's getting any information. We don't even know how CMS is setting these prices.
Yeah. All right. IRA bad is what I'm hearing. But I want to move to Gordon. Gordon is the CEO of the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance and its sister organization, the Schizophrenia and Psychosis SPAN.
Policy Action Network.
Policy Action Network. Thank you. Wow. Sorry, I've been up here a long time. And you're a patient organization. You're dealing with a very sick and sensitive population with severe mental illness. You've got a paper out today that gets into the science around therapies for schizophrenia and what might be done about it. So do you want to talk a little bit about how a patient might be viewing these changes and what your paper says?
Thanks, Joel. And everyone, in your pamphlet, you have a one-pager summary of the Schizophrenia Medicines in Development report that we released earlier today. There's a QR code on it. I encourage you to check it out and go to the full report. For people living with schizophrenia, spectrum disorders, and psychosis, there are unimaginable barriers to daily living. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, if you don't have a direct family member or a friend on your way home tonight, you will absolutely pass somebody on the street who has untreated severe mental illness. So my comments are mostly going to be around the political will, the societal will, and most importantly, the human will. How much longer are we going to walk past someone on the street talking to themselves, or unhoused, or even worse, incarcerated, not having any access to treatment of any sort that they deserve? Those are the human downstream effects of what untreated schizophrenia looks like. Everything is stacked against this community. The human toll on the family, not being able to work, losing your job, losing your spouse, losing everything matters. And the cost for that is unimaginable. We know, we did a research study a few years ago, it's over $200 billion in excess costs. And that is a dramatically underreported number. Why? We're not collecting good data at the state level and at the local level. That number is going to be well north of $400 billion if we could collect all of the real data that's there. So it's really about how do we get access to care and access through care. The access to care is unimaginable because first you have to see your loved one with signs or symptoms that concern you. Then you have to actually find a clinician, whether you're in Manhattan or rural North Dakota, who is willing to take on a patient. Why would you, if you can get paid as a provider relatively similar amounts for dealing with mild depression versus chasing someone around town with severe untreated schizophrenia? But if all of those things actually happen, you get the proper diagnosis, you actually get prescribed something that's been approved, and a lot of the treatments obviously have a risk-benefit profile, and there are some not lovely side effects typically. But if that profile is good enough and it allows you to have a more routine experience, we know until there's a cure, recovery is possible, but only if you get access to the provider, to the actual treatment, and innovation, right? It has been decades since we have had a new therapeutic breakthrough, and it happened last year, right? And there are over 25 products in various stages of clinical development. The promise is there. The last thing we need is to strangle the manufacturer's ability to innovate this patient population that has had so many things stacked against it. So for all of those reasons, there are major unintended political, societal, and most importantly, human consequences of a misguided policy like what's being proposed, which is outlined in our report.
Yeah, and so I usually describe the current policy environment as the most anti-policy driven environment in decades. Like 7 years ago, we were falling all over ourselves to get 21st Century Cures Part 2, or Part 1 actually, things into that, right? And now it seems like we're jumping on the anti-innovation train. So you mentioned last year a new product on the market. There's an implication here that products that come on the market face a price control in the future. So you've suggested in that paper there's a problem with that. Like, can you talk about that?
So adherence to medication is a real big problem for this patient community. And we know that there are certain formulations, long-acting medications, that work well for this patient community. So I'm not a drug developer, but I've heard the stories from families that if your son or daughter is really not reliable for taking that medication, and there's a formulation that can actually work, what incentive does a developer have after a couple of years of getting the thing on the market to then go through the process of reformulating into an LAM when you have less years of patent protection? This population is being discriminated against because there's no incentive to invest in a formulation that has the best chance of actually having efficacy for this population.
And there's a couple of products on the list this year that were selected for 2027, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So is that rippling through the community? Do you see that having an effect?
Absolutely. There's widespread concern. There were examples earlier today around the pharmacists who are angels from heaven, right? If you have a pharmacist at your table, hug them. What they are confronted with from the patient, from the family, they're angels. But what is really happening is that supply, that access, there's such paranoia, literally, around, is the medication going to disappear? I finally found something that works, and now you're going to do this. It's like one more wound in an already open wound.
So, sorry to stick with you for so much, but I just think this is so interesting because this population is so hard to treat, right? And the innovation hasn't been there for a while. The medicines that work best on brain illnesses have to cross the blood-brain barrier. And can you talk a little bit about pills versus biologics?
So typically, mostly, or completely, small molecules have to cross over that barrier, right? And in addition to medicine, right, there's all these wrap around the pill types of supports that are needed, psychosocial supports, social supports, et cetera, family. And that disincentive between 9 years and 13 years potentially could really shut out a company from wanting to even stay in the space, let alone go into the space. And this is the greatest population of unmet need that exists. So why create these disincentives for access when societally we're going to have all these negative, really negative outcomes, things like death by suicide, homelessness, incarceration, the really expensive stuff from a societal level. It's all going to happen if we don't innovate new products.
And on the healthcare, but you have to innovate the pills in order to address the brain illness. The pills are subject to price controls earlier. Fewer dollars will go into pills in this space. Like, it's a cascade, right? Like, this is absolutely flowing from a policy that was adopted in this law. So we've suggested repealing the 9-to-13 differential. EPIC Act was introduced by Congressman Murphy a couple days ago. But we would suggest we need a whole-scale restructuring of the IRA. So I'd kind of maybe turn back to Ryan and Kirsten. I'm often asked as a pro-market, pro-consumer guy, okay, what's your idea? How would you bring down drug prices? And I think a lot of times the answer is kind of, we don't know. Or it's not resonating with the public in a way that cuts politically. What would you say is the top issue in order to maybe bring down drug prices?
Well, I would say first, and this is kind of going to piggyback on what John said, people care about what they pay for a drug, right? And so they think they have insurance, they go and they don't get the value of the discount that's been negotiated from the plan. And so for me, the biggest thing you could do is to say, we're going to have patients at the pharmacy counter get access to the discounts. That would be first and foremost. I do think that it is somewhat of a trade issue. We need to have other countries paying their fair share of R&D costs, and hopefully that would have the result of lowering Americans' costs. I think we do have a segmented we have a segmented healthcare system, and so different solutions may be applicable for different parts of the healthcare system. I was talking to a Democrat member who voted for the IRA, and he said, yeah, that negotiation, that's not really a big thing. We already knew there was negotiation in Part D because the plans were negotiating. What they're getting was much different. And so, for something like Part D, I think the problem were patients actually getting access to the negotiated prices? Would there be different solutions for Medicare Part B? Yeah, I think there should be. Average sales price is a pretty good representation of what the average commercial price is in the market. But for certain drugs, where Medicare is the biggest volume purchaser of a particular drug, it doesn't actually represent what a volume purchaser would get on the open market. And so maybe you have to say, we're going to look at ASP, we're going to provide some sort of volume discount to the Medicare program when it's sort of the volume of Part B spend reaches a certain level compared to the overall spend of the drug. So I do think it depends on the market, but I think the two biggest things we can do, eliminate the disparity between the US and Europe, but two, make sure that people at the pharmacy counter get access to the drug or access to the negotiated price.
Yeah.
So just to add to that, first I'd look at some of the stupid stuff that's driving up drug prices that isn't giving a benefit to anybody, and the top of my list would be 340B. The patients aren't benefiting from, patient care is not directly benefiting from that program, so that would be one. I challenge a little bit the argument that we're going to be able to, and I agree, people don't like that we pay a lot more in this country relative to Germany. The problem is countries outside of the US have shown a willingness to deny care. So yes, they get lower prices, but they wait longer for their drugs. They're willing to deny care. So if we were to go back and say, no, you got to pay $2,000 more, they're going to say, no, we're going to deny care. So I'm not sure we're going to be able to get there. And what we've also seen is other countries are paying more for their R&D. China now has a quarter of all new drug development. A quarter. It was 3% a decade ago. It's tremendous. And I don't think China's going to give us the same price they give the Chinese government. So this is our market to lose. And I think we have to also think about what we're going to lose if we try to push down prices in the US to a level that doesn't sustain our investment in R&D.
Why did that shift? Do you know why that shift happened?
Because the Chinese government first adopted some of the good principles from Hatch-Waxman. There's better intellectual property than there used to be, and their government's investing in R&D at the same time ours is not.
So we've got the opposite policy almost than China does.
Yes. There's good scientists, there's a good education system, there's better patent protection, and there's more investment in R&D.
Interesting.
I would say one other thing, Joel. It is a risky proposition to develop a new drug. This may be outdated data, but it used to be for every 100 molecules that enter a phase 1 trial, one gets approved. We are on the verge of sort of technological advances when it comes to our ability to process information, both through AI, maybe quantum computing. So to de-risk the development process using those new tools, to truncate the time to develop a new product, and to have more certainty in the regulatory process using those new tools, hopefully if we reduce the cost to develop drugs, that may have an impact on drug pricing when it comes to the market.
All right, I know we've got a question, Sloan. Oh, open it up.
I have a question.
Questions? Anyone have a good idea on what we need to do? All right, well.
Oh, I see a question.
Oh. Over here.
Yeah, just a quick question. I was wondering, so for the Medicare drug price negotiation program, especially for like schizophrenia, what the impact would be. I think it makes sense for, like you said, for patients who like have not found their medication yet, right? They're still weighing on like innovation, whether it be like better side effect profile or better better functioning like medication for them. What does this like program do for patients, if anything, who have already found maybe medication that works for them? I think it's maybe a schizophrenic who has an antipsychotic they found effective. Is there any effect for them or no?
I'll switch to you, but I think what we're seeing in the marketplace right now is a much more aggressive management of those formularies, and it's making it harder for people who need those medicines to get actual access to the thing that works for them. So step therapy is a common management tool that a lot of plans will use to say, you've got to go here and then to here and then here. And fail on those therapies before you get to the one that might work best for you. The other thing we're seeing in the marketplace this year is products going off formulary or formulary exclusions. And so that product that might have worked for you might no longer be covered. And so you would have to either shop for a new plan or deal with the consequences of having that product not covered. And those are direct results of the Inflation Reduction Act. Like what we're seeing is that when we piled more risk on the plans, they responded by saying, we're going to increase our premiums, we're going to increase our cost sharing, we're going to increase our management, or we're going to get out of the market. And so that's the practical effect of the law, and that's how it's impacting, I think, a lot of patients right now. And I think it's going to get worse, not better, which is why we've suggested we need to fundamentally rethink this law to restabilize the market. There are things the administration can do and Congress can do. We're working with the administration to do the stabilization. But on the innovation side, I think it's a congressional job to kind of go in, fix the pill penalty, fix the Orphan Drug Act stuff, fix the negotiation process, because we're picking the stupidest drugs on the planet, apparently. But that's my short takeaway. And Gordon, I don't know if you want to add.
I'd just quickly add that in addition to that, you also have the step therapy, right? You have to go through before you get access to the thing that might actually work. And then the prior auth requirement, we've seen data, something like 60% of patients who have actually done everything right. They saw the symptoms, they found a doctor, they got a diagnosis, and they actually got prescribed something, but they can't get the prior auths approved. Where do those people go in the system? They don't come back.
Because of their condition. Yeah. All right, let's say thanks to this panel.